Okay. So as Dan mentioned, I'm Seth. I lead the engineering team at Signpost. I don't know if we're one of the hottest stars in New York right now or not, but we do make software as a service that helps small businesses market themselves. So we automate marketing. We're an automated CRM for small businesses, and it turns out that is hugely useful to them. I have been at Signpost for about 2.5 years. I was going to give a whole presentation about Signpost, but Dan said I should actually talk about coding things instead of pushing my company. But I love programming. I started programming when I was 10. I've been programming ever since, but I'm not going to talk about programming tonight. So sorry for the bait and switch, but I was asking myself, what could I present that would have the biggest impact? What do I wish I had known a lot earlier in my career? And it's basically management fundamentals. So Dan was slightly inaccurate. I'm not actually going to talk about software engineering management. I'm going to go even deeper than that. I'm just going to talk about management. I thought I could either, add a microscopic amount to your tech knowledge or potentially add something significant to your managerial knowledge. But I also want to push on this concept that engineers make lousy managers. I think that is kind of conventional wisdom in our culture, that engineers are somewhere on the autism spectrum, or they're hipster prima donnas or something like that, and not who you want leading a team or managing. I have a contrarian view. I actually think engineers make the best managers by far of everything, not just software. And I think that they are pretty much the only legitimate leaders of software teams. I don't think you can effectively lead a software team without having a background in engineering. So my goals in this talk are to hopefully demystify management a little bit for everyone, and to support my claim that engineers can be great managers, besides referencing Bill Gates. And to share some fundamental management concepts that will hopefully help you think about management and recognize these things in your day-to-day job and help you talk about management. It's just useful to have these concepts kicking around your head, and share some things that I've learned the hard way in the hopes that you will not have to learn them the hard way, and then give a very tiny bit of advice for anyone interested in becoming a manager. This talk is not like a litany of management tips. Management has an enormous breadth and depth. I'm not going to try to teach you how to manage, because that would be absurd. That would be like, I'm going to teach you engineering tonight. Management is a massive discipline. I just want to get to kind of the heart of the matter and hopefully make some engineers a bit more comfortable with management, because I think a lot of us missed out on that in our educational trajectories. Okay, so like any good manager, I'm going to start by collecting data. How many of you here are actual managers directly supervising someone else who is not named Mike? No, who's not this guy? Managers? Cool, great. How many of you feel like you have a really solid understanding of management? All right, I should talk to you. That was interesting. No one raised their hand for the record, except that guy. How many of you would like to become managers, are interested in becoming managers? A few. Okay, great. How many of you would rather write Perl than be managers? Think about that. This is Perl. All right. Okay, well, I hope this talk will benefit you as well. In that I just think it's really good to at least have some management knowledge that will help you contribute to your team. And I've noticed that a lot of engineers go through this kind of arc where they go into management for a while and meet with some success, or don't meet with much success, and then they go back to engineering. That's fine. That's healthy. I consider it like a tour of duty. And I find that people who have gone through some management they're just amazing engineers on my team. Like, those are the best engineers to have. So I think management skill makes you a really much better engineer in like a totally orthogonal dimension to your engineering skill. Okay, so what is management? It's something that we all interact with every day in all of these different ways. But do we really have a solid grasp on what it is? Can we really nail it down? Like, what does a manager do? What is the purpose of a manager, right? Like, we see all these activities, we see KPIs and OKRs and spreadsheets and hiring and firing and, you know, all these pipelines and all that. But what does a manager do? What is management? I thought we could look at some misconceptions that have been kicking around in the development community. I think a lot of people equate management with project management. Project management is project management. It is not management. You're managing something, it's a project. Project management is typically closed-ended. You have a deliverable, you have a target, etc. Project management is a great skill to develop. It is not trivial, but it is not management. It is not the same thing as running an engineering team. Some people think management is leadership. Management definitely has a very strong leadership component, and I encourage everyone who wants to be a manager to read about leadership and practice leadership, but management and leadership are not exactly the same thing. And of course, a lot of developers think management is Scrum. And that's basically like saying software is the JVM and nothing else, right? Scrum is an aspect of software management, which is a discipline within engineering management, which is, you know, part of management. Management is a lot bigger than Scrum or software management. The economic definition of management, by the way, is allocation of capital. Great. So now we know that. Not super helpful. That rings kind of hollow. A manager then being someone who invests capital to solve problems bigger than they can solve themselves is a little bit better. But let's try to make it a bit more concrete. So this is a great book. Has anyone read this book? Show of hands. All right, I'm doing some good here tonight. This is a great book and you should read it. This is a book written by an engineer that is about management, but it's not about engineering management. It's just management in general. It happens to be written by founder of Intel, Andy Grove. Beautifully written book, super clear, not long, not boring. Could not recommend it more. And in this book, he defines a manager's output as the output of his organization plus the output of the neighboring organizations under his influence. That's kind of a higher order term that we can ignore for the purposes of this talk. But defining a manager's output as the output of his organization is very interesting because, you know, it really brings clarity to the purpose of a manager, right? A manager's output is not actually KPI reports. A manager's output is not actually one-on-ones with his or her staff. A manager's output is the output of his or her team, that department. So we can frame management then as a means of abstraction for an organization, right? So we're all familiar with abstraction, which means compound elements can be named and manipulated as units, right? This is the basis of good software design. This is the basis of all software design, abstraction, modularity, right? Management is that concept applied to an organization. This is the structure of an organization, is this concept that the engineering team at Signpost is a unit, and you can kind of chastise that team through me. Right, you can direct that team through me. You can say, we're strategically realigning towards partnerships, and the whole engineering team will slew behind that, right? Whether it's 2 or 220,000 people, right? This is management. So I thought I would make a helpful block diagram, right? We all love those. To describe what Andy Grove is talking about. And what's interesting about this is, you know, this is a classic black box abstraction, right? It is solution agnostic to what's going on in here. We don't know about what's going on in here. We kind of don't care, again, oversimplifying. In reality, like, metrics also come out of this. But if anyone in here is a double E, if I made that a triangle, what would that be? No, an amplifier. So here's the signal, and here's like the current. Here's the power voltage, in this really good book by Peter Drucker called The Effective Executive, which I also recommend. It's dated, but in like a really quaint way. He's talking about like how the Japanese do everything better. He says organization is a means of multiplying the strength of an individual. So my concept of management at the root is really the combination of this concept of amplification and abstraction, right? So, you know, when we want to take a different technical direction at Signpost, at the end of the day, that's my call. But it's executed by the team, right? So I'm saying like, no. Like, we need an API to wrangle all this stuff. This is a huge mess. We need to fix this. I'm not doing that. That's just my conception, and it is executed by 20 people. That is the amplification that is management. And that is how, as a manager, you get to make extremely expensive mistakes. Now, if we look at the level of individual engineer, instead of budget, you just have their compensation, right? But it's the exact same block diagram, right? This is a decomposable tree structure we're all familiar with. It's the exact same interface as a manager. And we can move upward as well, right? This goes from the top of Alphabet all the way down to the front line at Google, right? Enterprise, usually the goal is simply increase the value of the enterprise. We call it capital, usually at this level, but it does change the state of the world. So this is my view on, you know, how management is really a mechanism for decomposing a difficult problem, right? Which is, how do we perform the complex processes of an enterprise? The only way to do that, as we all know, we're software engineers, you decompose that into smaller subproblems, right? That's all we do all day. So the punchline is, teams are modules, and managers are their public interfaces, right? I think this is 99% true. Okay, so in that same book, Andy Grove lays out a couple other interesting things, but he makes a really big point about these two concepts, which are extremely helpful to understand. And they are managerial leverage and what he called task relevant maturity, which doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. So I call it TRM, as does he. Managerial leverage, extremely simple concept. Basically, how much power does someone on my team give me? Are they a super experienced architect, and I can say, build a new platform that does this, and they will get it done, and I can give them leverage in the form of like junior engineers? Or are they a junior engineer, in which case, you know, I will have to give them a totally different kind of task, right? And this leads right into the concept of task-relevant maturity. And he takes pains to point out that it's task-relevant maturity. It's not general maturity, right? Like, you can have an expert Oracle DBA and say, hey, run our Mongo cluster or something, and they will have no idea what's going on. Like, they will truly have no idea what's going on. So the managerial leverage you get from someone is related to how experienced they are at the particular task you give them. And this is very dynamic, right? Like, you know, throughout the course of a quarter at Signpost, like, people will move through several different kinds of tasks. And this really helps illuminate some managerial failure modes that I have personally experienced several times. So I'll go through the low TRM side first. If you have someone who pretty much does not know what they're doing, they've never done this before, and you have low oversight for them on that task, you wind up here, which is technically called epic fail. And I have done that several times before I learned to stop doing that. If you have high oversight for someone who is doing something for the first time or their second time, maybe it's similar to something they've done before, but they've never done this exact thing before, then you have development. And this is great. Development is a key part of being a manager, right? Developing your team. And it's something that engineers love to do, right? But you really need to pay attention to where they are in their TRM for this task, right? And you don't want to get them too far out over their skis, or they will fail, and it will be your fault. Everything is the manager's fault. If someone has a lot of experience in a task, you can give them low oversight. That's actually the point of hiring people with a lot of experience. And this is just called leverage. They give you vast, vast leverage, right? I have some amazingly experienced people on my team. And if you have someone who's very experienced and you subject them to like really high levels of oversight, that's micromanagement. Micromanagement is obviously no one's favorite kind of management. So I really like the TRM concept because it lets us frame these things that like we've all witnessed, right, in a very, very, very simple way. Okay, so now I'm going to address this thing that I find personally kind of annoying, which is this cultural dichotomy that managers and engineers are cut from very different cloth. I think that's totally bogus, both empirically and just, theoretically. Why do I think that? Well, let's go through the management skill set and see how many of you think you have these skills. Creating processes. I do that all day, right? I'm a manager, not an engineer. Anticipating problems, right? That's key. Creative problem solving, utterly required if you want to really rock as a manager. Creative solutions, very valuable. Monitoring performance of systems, whether they be your database or your web app or your web app team. Designing communication structures, when this breaks down, it's very painful at the management level as well as at the engineering level. Architecting concurrent systems, that is how I think about building teams, right? Is I'm looking for like loose coupling between tasks. It is all in the language of concurrency, at least in my mind. And then collecting and understanding data, right? The best managers are data-driven. The best engineering is data-driven, premature optimization being the root of all evil. Build it, analyze it, understand it, improve it. And then you have leadership. And now we're kind of off the map for engineers, but that is critical. In my mind, a great manager is simply an engineer who can lead. Period. I'm biased. Okay, so now that I have shared some of the fundamental management concepts, I'd like to talk about common failure modes for engineers as managers. And I'm intimately familiar with these because I have done them. I think all of them several times. Cool, so staying in the code, AKA doing your old job. Everyone knows this one. We've all seen it. We've all done it, maybe at multiple jobs. But this is a really pernicious one, right? The reason we got into engineering is because we love it and we're good at it now, presumably, for kind of moving into management, and we feel productive when we are slinging code and showing the kiddies how it's done. But guess what? It's not your job anymore. I think everyone has a really strong bias to do things that feel like they're being productive and do things that are easy for them. And if your choice is like, well, I can improve our caching layer, or I can try hiring great engineers in this job market for engineers, most engineers are gonna strongly gravitate towards, well, I'm going to code today, I'm going to ship some code, that'll be getting something done. And they'll just be pulled in the direction of like feeling productive, right? Everyone wants to feel productive, but you have to fight that urge. So, I definitely went through this phase where I would just like sit there and stare at my monitor and try to like figure out what the right thing to do was. And I knew it wasn't code, but I did not know what the right thing to do was. This does not mean you should not get down in the weeds sometimes. It just means you have to be very suspicious of that voice in your head saying, what do I do for a living? I code. That voice is no longer accurate. As a manager, your job is simply to do what the company needs done. And often that's not clear. Like, part of your job as a manager is to actually figure that out. And this is another one, is a lot of engineers kind of float to the top. There's maybe a Peter Principle effect going on here. Maybe you're at a 10-person startup and the CTO bails out and they're like, hey, guess what? You're the new CTO or VP Eng or whatever it is. That happens a lot. So, okay, well, I guess I'm in charge of the engineering team now. Do you love it? Maybe not. And this is really tough. You're probably not going to succeed, and you might not know why you're not succeeding, but there's this kind of downward spiral of not loving your job and having low morale and being very confused and being in a suddenly very different situation, and now you're going to the exec meetings and like, what are these about? What am I doing here? I just want to be coding. I'm not doing well. I'm getting yelled at for metrics I don't understand, etc. And it's just really hard to succeed, right? And I think this happens in engineering because a lot of startups have a hard time finding engineering leadership, and they kind of lean towards the we'll have a non-technical person lead engineering, or we'll have an engineer who's never managed before lead engineering, right? Those are very, very common, and they're both pretty bad. But if you can be a prepared engineer who's now leading engineering, I think that would be excellent. Also, you lead by example, whether you know it or not. So if your example is like, I'm clearly not enjoying my job, that is going to spread throughout your team, and that is also, you own the output of the engineering team now. That is going to impair the output of that team. Not hiring the best. So if you get a chance to hire someone who is way, way, way better than you, what do? You hire them, right? As engineers, if you interview an engineer who is fantastic, you might start to feel a little bit insecure, right? Wow, this person is probably the best engineer I've ever met. Do I want to be outshone by someone on my own team? That's something a lot of managers, not just engineers, struggle with, right? Hiring a really super bright, kick-ass, energetic person can be intimidating, especially if they're like half your age or something. The failure mode here is really being deeply misguided about what your job is now. Now it is your job to build the best team. Now it is your job to hire people smarter than you. That is how you will be evaluated as a manager. If you hire this amazing person and you're like, look how amazing this person is, that person works for me, you're an amazing manager. Not hiring someone better than you would be like not buying a car because it could drive faster than you can run. That doesn't make any sense, right? You're hiring a component that you want to execute on behalf of your organization. Hire the best component that makes sense for the business. Ideally, everyone on your team will be smarter and better than you. That would be a fantastic team. Okay, engineers gone wild. This is one of my favorites. I've seen this a lot in New York. What does this mean? You can often detect this when you hear things like, we're moving our mail merge into Kafka, or we're rewriting all of our templates in Haskell. A lot of tech meetups are kind of like crack for this failure mode, I think. This is when the activity of engineers is not perfectly aligned with the business or not well aligned with the business. And I think it develops when you have weak or misguided engineering leadership who really can't lay down the law, right? Like, your job is not to do engineering stuff. Your job is to execute on the strategy of your business. So if you are afraid to be like, oh, I know we shouldn't be doing this thing in Kafka, but they really like it, it makes them happy, and if I take it away, I'm probably going to lose like 1 or 2 of my best people. Lose them. Right? They're not moving the enterprise forward, right? And if you can't make them move the enterprise forward, save the money. One of the things I love about Signpost is we get shit done, and that goes from top to bottom of the culture. We don't screw around, and that applies very strongly in the engineering team. And the last failure mode that I find hilarious is this one. It's the wearing your lack of management on your sleeve. So to me, this is code for we literally have no idea what management is. Like, we honestly do not know. Like, what is an org chart? I have no idea what an org chart is. I think this one is pretty pernicious because to me, a key aspect of an organization, especially an engineering organization, is really developing all the members of that organization, right? We do development, but I do development of people. That's a big part of my job. I make that very explicit. Anyone who has any kind of management role in the engineering organization at Signpost knows that they are in charge of developing junior talent, right? Like, that's just part of serving your team well. If you have a totally flat organization, it's just like people running around doing whatever they want, they're probably not learning maximum, regardless of what's happening in your business. Are people really learning the best skills? Are they learning to execute the best? I suspect not. My response to this is like, so you have a program that is one module, right? Like, how's that working out? Modularity, decomposability is power, right? Flatness is like COBOL. So, I've just gone through a bunch of failure modes, but I don't want to discourage anyone. My experience is that the alternative, which is non-engineers leading engineering teams, is just like flat out failure, right? So this is amazingly better than the places I've seen where non-technical people are trying to run a software team. That just is a disaster. Okay, so let's say that was actually a super compelling sales pitch and everyone wants to move into management now. What are the upsides and downsides? Why would you want to do that, and why would you not want to do that? Why you would want to do that, I think, is because it's hard. It is a true challenge. It's not like I like challenges, meaning I like to do Sudoku puzzles, but I like challenges, meaning like I just lost $250,000 because I made a mistake and I have to build that much enterprise value now to make up for it. That doesn't happen every day. It is, I would say, less fun than engineering, right? That's why people have engineering hobbies and no one has a management hobby. I'm not going to mention comp, because to me it's not worth it. Like, you can't be chasing moolah if that's what's motivating you to go into management. I think you're going to be a very unhappy person and you won't do well. I think you have to do it for the sense of leverage, for the feeling of, I am building an entire product now. Before, I was building a small part of a product. Now I am building an entire product for a large company. That is an interesting feeling. You might want to try it out. It is difficult. So if you wanted to make this transition, how would you go about doing it? We have a nice discrete data structure here. This is you. This is where you want to be in 2 years. How do you interpolate between those layers, right? This is pretty discrete. It's not a continuum. Well, I think you can impose a continuum on here, right? You can move in the direction of management, and ideally, your manager would love for you to do this, right? This is called stepping up, right? There are several different ways to step up. It depends on how your organization is structured. Ideally, you would have a mentor, but one way is just to take ownership of a complex deliverable, right? Like, oh, this project needs to be done, it's hard. I'll do that. I'll do that, and I will get it done on time and under budget with 0 defects. The next step up would be to own a complex deliverable that you can't do all by yourself. Say, I can do that, but I will need Nathan. With Nathan, I can deliver this in 6 weeks. Now you are kind of managing Nathan. You're not his boss. What about owning a component, owning a subsystem in your organization, right? You can own the roadmap. You can say, like, okay, these are the ways the system needs to be improved to best deliver value to the business, right? So you can take ownership of things before you get to the level of really being, management layer proper. And then having now developed a few managers, I've stumbled along this path myself. For people below me, I have tried to create like a very smooth, explicit ramp-up process. And towards the end of it, I usually will give them one direct report, just one, to see how it goes. And check in with that direct report and be like, how is your manager? And if it goes well, then give them 2, 4, 8, whatever. I am not a fan of just taking someone and chucking them into the deep end. Those mistakes will probably be pretty expensive for the business. Okay, so one more thing I would recommend if you're going to move into management is start prepping yourself a little bit. I highly recommend these books. Who here has read The Mythical Man Month? Yeah, yes, this is good stuff. That's, probably, I don't know, the first book written on software engineering management, which is basically do not do what IBM did. IBM discovered what not to do for all of us in like 1960. Great book. Fred Brooks got a Turing Award for that, I believe. Next, High Output Management, also a luminary in the space, Andy Grove. And then this guy, Ed Catmull, president of Pixar, software company, also an entertainment company. I really like this book just in itself, but it's extremely applicable to software because it's about managing creative people, and software engineers are creative people, and that's what a lot of managers don't really understand about managing software engineering teams, is it's not, it looks like a factory pipeline, but it's not a pipeline. It is creativity. So I think this is an extremely applicable book to managing engineering teams. And then to wrap up, I would summarize this as management is not rocket science, but respect it. It is very difficult. Try it yourself if you don't believe it. It takes practice, it takes a lot of experience in learning, and you will make very painful mistakes that impact people's lives. It is fire, so treat it with respect. I think engineering is a great background for management. I think the data somewhat bears this out. See Gates and Grove and Catmull and many, many others, Zuckerberg. It's all about quantitative analytical problem solving, and that's the essence of management. Like an MBA, they try to like bolt this stuff onto a liberal arts background or something. But if you came from engineering, you have it. You already breathe that stuff. You're better off. And if you're going to do it well. Don't phone it in. This job is not easy if you're doing it right. If you think things are going well, you're definitely not looking at the right things. So you should clearly decide this is something you want to do before strapping yourself to the bull. Learn about it and dedicate yourself to doing it well. And you will probably do it well. And now, exit poll. Was this useful to anyone? Wow, okay. Great. That's it. Thanks. Do we have time for questions?
A couple of minutes for Q&A, so just chat around. Do you think being a manager and having a budget necessarily go hand in hand?
Not necessarily, but I think it's very highly correlated.
So if you basically have the responsibility without the money, what's the impact of that? Because I see that happening as well.
Oh, sorry, you meant if you, right, I thought you meant just like open-ended, like spend all the money you want.
No, like actually having a budget, like just like
right.
having, you get what I'm saying, like, I mean, a small organization, but it's like, okay, people you're in charge of, quote, unquote, but like, can you make decisions in a financial sense or whatnot, or is that necessarily intertwined to people who supervise it? Like, what's the intuition between the financial side and obviously the management aspect?
Yeah, I think, well, a lot of times, like you're project manager, like technical project manager or something, that is your exact situation, right? You're managing people who are not your direct reports. Sometimes you're like co-writing performance reviews or something. I think those often go hand in hand. I think it is easier when you have the financial authority, but I don't think that they are 100% of the time aligned. Does that answer your question? All right.
Yeah, I thought everything you said was great. One thing you said that didn't sound so great was you said manager is a public interface to their team. Well, could you clarify that a bit? Because, yeah.
Yes. Sure. So, package visibility, public, private, whatever. You have the internals of an engineering team, right? And then you have the externals. So when I said the manager is the public interface, basically, if our web app goes down, the expression is I'm the throat to choke. Right? Like I am the interface to the exec team, to the board, to the investors, right? Like you can't really violate that abstraction barrier and like go, yelling at platform engineers, right? for better or worse, like the manager is kind of a communications bottleneck to the rest of the org. And there are all kinds of, improvements on that oversimplification. But, as, being responsible, right? If you want to direct engineering, you simply direct engineering through me. Right, and you don't have to understand all the machinations of what that means, if we'll have to like overhaul our persistence strategy and we'll have to do all the security work and everything. You don't have to care. That is encapsulated, and you access it through me. And I think all that in my meetings with the management team, thinking like, oh boy, like this has so many implications for all these systems, right? But I'm encapsulating that. I'm providing that abstraction. So that's what I meant.
Okay, so I took that to mean like all. Are you saying all communication goes through the manager? Because okay.
No. All responsibility flows through the manager. All accountability flows through the manager. All, high-level direction, like strategic direction, flows through the manager.
Cool.
Does that make sense?
Yes, you do.
You mentioned being the manager is data-driven, and I wondered if you could tell me about some of the data you use to drive decisions as an engineering manager.
Sure. So we collect two kinds of data. We collect kind of system operational data, and then we collect data around our development process itself, and that is the more fuzzy data. The operational data is pretty massive. We operate at a reasonably high volume, and that all flows into Amazon CloudWatch and Datadog, and usually is overseen by a component owner. And then on the kind of task tracking side, we track the status of our projects and the evolution of our projects. We track kind of like the pipeline, where you can see is like something piling up in QA, and that can drive, that usually drives your hiring, right? Like, if things are piling up in QA, you might need like more test engineers. You might need a different strategy to QA. So it really falls usually into those two categories, and then the ops stuff. I'm sure everyone is super familiar with all like the queue depth and RDS, CPU load, and all that stuff. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, the system side is like one thing. I think we all do. That's the collecting data on the other side. Engineering performance and team performance.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do well. Sorry, you in the back have had your hand up for a while.
What was the worst management mistake you have made?
Wow, I'll have to go through the logs. I used to actually keep a mistake log, and that got too depressing. Worst management mistake, dear God. I've made so many. One very expensive one was, like I said, I have enormous leverage as the VP of engineering, and the buck really stops with me. So we built a system that had a marginal cost for its operation that wasn't like just paying AWS, but was integrating with a partner, and we didn't have adequate monitoring on that. Right. So this is an example of failed engineering leadership, right? Where I was the top of the chain in the organization who could really form the thought of the failure mode of this system is if we fail open and start sending erroneous messages into this system, it will directly result in impacting our cache position at Signpost. That was a very unpopular failure of mine. Sure. I think you had your...
So you're clearly a non-believer in flat organizations. What do you feel about companies like Airbus
Holacracy?
who
Yeah. Boy, that's a fun experiment to watch someone else go through.
succeed, or
I think they're insane. I mean, people in economics get, the economics Nobel Prize for like trying to understand why the firm exists, right? On the one hand you have the market, and on the other hand you have the firm, and like in reality it's usually a blending of those two things, right? Contractors and vendors. But like if you try to kind of dissolve the firm and make everyone this kind of like, I don't know, like a weird free agent on salary or I would be very surprised if that worked. I would be even more surprised if you could scale from 2 people to the size of Zappos doing that. I'm pretty sure that would not work. And throughout the course of human enterprise since the Renaissance, I think there's a good reason why management has kind of evolved, right? Like organizations are subject to evolutionary pressures, right? If this craziness was such a great idea, wouldn't we have discovered it earlier?
So if it does work, does it invalidate everything you said?
Maybe. I'll take that bet. I think it invalidates my bias against flat organizations where you just have like people running around doing whatever they feel like.
That was awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks.